So it's now time to introduce you to the man otherwise known as the long-haired Viking, Neil Oliver, Pride of Scotland, Neil Oliver, Stirling, Scotland. And without any postcode or anything, the letters are all reaching him. Neil, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike.
Well,
they're a great pleasure at the moment.
Yeah, I bet they are. I mean, I've seen you putting some of them out on Twitter. People are being very kind of creative about the letters that they send you. And I suppose the good thing about being the subject of a page lead in The Sun, it's not actually scandalous.
Yeah, it's lovely. It started a while back. Envelopes that were finding their way to me, sometimes just with a drawing of me. On Twitter, my profile pic is now one of the many pictures of me, and the Royal Mail, God love them, have been finding me with every one, I think, and it's such a treat. I love the idea more than anything else. It's the fact that to send a tweet or an email is the stuff of moments, but this is all evidence of people sitting down to write letters. And then the envelopes are often painted or drawn upon very skillfully. They must have taken hours maybe to do some of it, and then they go put a stamp on, go and post it, and then there's that whole interconnected chain of people at the Royal Mail that ensure its delivery to me, and I find that very heartwarming indeed.
It really is, because when you say put a stamp on and post it, actually that's a lot more complex now than it used to be, because most of the post offices in Britain have been shut down. So I mean, it's really, I get put off the idea of sending anything to anyone because it's such a rigmarole to go and find a place where you can buy some stamps, put the stamp on an envelope, or if it's something that has to be weighed, go and find somewhere that actually operates as a mini post office.
I know, it shows real commitment. I got one yesterday or the day before that said, "To the rightful King of Scotland," and it came. So I've always planned to end up living in Stirling Castle.
Yes.
So later today, I might dispatch a lorry full of Faro and ball paint up there, get the place tidied up a bit.
Well, I mean, it must make a pleasant change from all the cyber nat abuse you've been suffering over the years.
Well, I think it's symptomatic, isn't it? It doesn't take any kind of effort to send something hurtful and cruel and whatever via social media, but you'd have to be motivated by, I think, something stronger, which is affection. Let's say, to go to the trouble of writing an actual letter and just going through all the steps that you just outlined there to make sure it comes to me. And I think it's that aspect of human nature is much more likely to be shown up and demonstrated in something like an old-fashioned letter than it is via any other means of communication.
And are the senders of these messages, obviously they're generally complimentary, but are they all of different sort of ages, different parts of the world? What?
Yeah, it's all over. If they're coming in from all over the place. Yeah, and it's all sorts of folk. I suppose over the years I've done book tours and whatever, and I've been approached by people that have read my books or have seen me on the television, and it's another glimpse of that same congregation, if you like. Yeah. It's those same folk, all ages, men and women. Some youngsters obviously are in there in some of it, and I just love it. It rekindles my faith in human nature.
Yes, which we can all do with at the moment. I'll tell you something else that must have rekindled your faith in human nature was yesterday, sort of early part of the evening, when David Davis stood up in the House of Commons, completely unexpectedly. I mean, I don't know if anybody knew he was going to do this, but I certainly didn't. And I actually missed it because I was on the phone to somebody at the time. By the time I got back onto the parliamentary channel, it wasn't there. But let's have a quick look at what he said.
I have it on good authority that there exists, from the 6th of February 2018, an exchange of messages between civil servants Judith McKinnon and Barbara Allison, suggesting the First Minister's Chief of Staff is interfering in the complaints process against Alex Salmond. The investigating officer complained, and I quote, "Liz interference v bad." I assume that means very bad. If true, this suggests the Chief of Staff had knowledge of the Salmond case in February, not in April, as she has claimed on oath. The First Minister also tied herself to that April date in both parliamentary and legal statements. She was, of course, aware earlier than that. The question is just how aware and how much earlier.
I mean, absolutely mind-blowing stuff, Neil, because, he basically later said that the information that he's got from this whistleblower is showing perjury up to criminal conspiracy.
For me, it's without a doubt the most potentially devastating speech I've ever seen delivered inside the Palace of Westminster. It ought to have consequences most severe.
Yeah.
And we'll see what actually happens. But I watched the jungle drums were beating, and I was made aware of that, of David Davis being on his feet in the House of Commons, and I caught the second half and just watched and listened, chin on chest. But then at the same time, it can now be said a lot of it has been common knowledge here in Scotland. I mean, many of us were talking about exactly this, but obviously it was being kept under wraps by all sorts of illegal techniques that were meaning that it wasn't possible to talk about it publicly without the risk of drawing down a criminal prosecution upon yourself.
Right.
So it was like it was like the relief of having an abscess dealt with. There was that sudden rush of relief, and I mean the smell. It's just a rotten smell in Scotland, and the bigger challenge really is the abscess maybe has been lanced at the moment, but the impacted molar is still stuck in the jawbone and has yet to come out, has yet to be removed. But as a television viewer, I've never seen anything like that myself.
No, and Nicola Sturgeon, of course, characteristically has kind of dismissed what he said, but I don't know how much longer she can continue to do that, given that now, as you say, the hair is running, as it were, because you're quite right that up in Scotland, she appeared before that committee for 8 hours, and it all kind of went away because people were just kind of stunned into what could only be described as some kind of torpor, because she spent 8 hours saying literally nothing at all. And the media kind of moved away from it. I think 2 days later, I checked up on the BBC's Scotland website for news, and there was no mention of it at all. Just like as if it had gone and disappeared in the middle of the night. And I think for David Davis to make these accusations in Parliament, and I understand as well that they haven't done it in Scottish Parliament for reasons of no privilege. Apparently, there is no parliamentary privilege in the Scottish Parliament, which I didn't actually know. So I think somebody surely in Scotland, now that there's an election process about to start, will surely pick up on
it. It's so difficult to make those sorts of predictions and to draw those sorts of conclusions because, for months, for years now, a lot of us have become exhausted with prefacing comments with statements like "this must" and "surely it will," because time and again that apparent inevitability has been thwarted. And the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, is the uncrowned queen of somebody else did that, I didn't know, I forgot, I can't recall. A big boy did it and he ran away. And that has been the standard of defence, but it has worked. And there's always been this fallback position also where she has said, it's only for the people of Scotland to decide what happens to me. Which so far has been a fairly cast iron line of defence behind which she has stood. But it's absolutely the case. David Davis's speech, his testimony in the Palace of Westminster lays bare what we have known up here and what we have talked about in extreme frustration for the longest time. Something is rotten in the state of Scotland. But whether this is finally the beginning of the process of excising the cancer remains to be seen.
It does, but as I say, without anybody's kind of will to do so up there, it hasn't happened yet. But I'm assuming, and you're right to say that I have no right reason to assume this really, but you would assume that as part of an election strategy by the opposition parties, they would bring this up. Certainly Ruth Davidson will be doing something about it, I'm sure.
Well, you'd think so, but as you mentioned there, parliamentary privilege doesn't operate in the Scottish Parliament. It's that freedom that David Davis demonstrated, that freedom to stand up on his hind legs and make that certain that there would be no. That he couldn't be legally silenced for so doing. That doesn't prevail in Scotland. And as he was saying in that speech, the devolution settlement in Scotland has failed amongst other things to deliver that to elected representatives in Scotland. They're not covered by parliamentary privilege, which won't be broadly known by most people. But it's a frightening reality for people to finally be made aware of. This is the Scotland that people like myself are living in, and that's why I've said all along that I, as a British citizen, I demand protection from people like the Scottish National Party, and the very idea that the Scottish National Party would pursue independence, when we've seen what the Scottish National Party are like. It's not independence that the SNP want, it's privacy.
Yes.
Their objective is to hive off a part of the Long Island of Britain and shut the door and draw the curtains, so that's the kind of operation they run, the kind of operation that is to go on behind closed doors and drawn curtains. And the hate crime bill fits into that pattern. That was a preemptive move to make sure that in the future they'd be able to silence criticism, make it that bit harder for people to say, I don't like what's happening here. It's the dodgy uncle saying, shush, this is just a secret between you and me. Don't tell anybody about this. Right. That's been the sinister backdrop to the lives of people in Scotland. And finally, what David Davis did yesterday is a step along a necessary road. But it's as a citizen of Britain, I refuse to be left in the hands of people like this. And you can see now the kind of independent Scotland that they would sculpt if they were given the opportunity and the freedom to do.
And it's a kind of two-headed snake in some ways, because Ian Blackford yesterday had the cheek to kind of criticise the government's bill, the police bill in London, in the Parliament in Westminster, because he said that it was a terrible infringement on people's freedom of speech. And you kind of go, well, hang on a minute, you guys have just passed a hate crime bill in Scotland, which makes it illegal to basically say stuff.
It's unbelievable. It's an out-of-body experience. It's surreal to watch the hate crime bill being nodded through. And I'll say again, nodded through by not just by the SNP, but complicit in that were Labour, Lib Dem and the Greens that nodded that through. The only political party that stood against it were the Conservatives. Yeah. And then in the next breath, to suggest that the legislation that's going through Westminster might be might infringe and impinge on people's freedom of speech. The temerity and the audacity. I don't know how anybody's got the nerve to behave in that way, but it comes back to a situation that you and I have discussed here before. There's no honour. It's a dishonourable state of affairs. I mean, I'm well old enough to remember when a sequence of events like this would have inevitably led to wholesale resignations across the board. People would have quietly taken themselves off. It's practically the behaviour where, in the old black and white movies, somebody retired to their study with a bottle of whiskey and a service revolver. Yes. I mean, it's a disgraceful state of affairs. And yet I don't expect resignations from it, because resignations depend upon people taking a stand on principle, but these are not principled people.
No, I mean we've long forgotten, I think, that the principle of any politician now resigning in any situation. I mean, almost all of them have to be more or less kind of given their marching orders, which I think is what happened to Mike Hill up in Hartlepool, because there's been a long-running sexual harassment case, which is going to be heard finally, I think, in May of this year. And he was obviously left with no choice. But clearly, he's a guy that probably should have resigned a while ago.
I mean, the sleaze around the SNP it would make a billy goat, it would turn a billy goat's stomach. There's the chief whip in Westminster, having to stand down amid allegations of having sexually pestered a teenager, a young man. Yeah. The former finance secretary Derek Mackay, had to step away from his post because he had been bombarding a 16-year-old boy with texts, including calling him cute. Yeah. He's still on the payroll. He's still claiming his expenses. Yeah. The campaign manager for Angus Robertson, the former leader of the SNP in Westminster, he's up on charges at the moment of voyeurism. I mean, the sleaziness around these characters, right up at the highest levels within the Scottish National Party, it should lead to condemnation and resignations right across the board. But that's not how things actually unfold in Scotland, and it hasn't been the case for years now.
And I can't imagine a situation more ridiculous in a way in any other country, apart from perhaps places like, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, where, the First Minister, who is effectively the head of the Scottish government, is married to the guy that's the head of the SNP. And so there's no kind of separation of church and state, if you like.
Well, that's almost a cosmetic complication within the SNP. I mean, the fundamental problems were there in what David Davis was outlining last night. Because of the failure of the devolution settlement, the inadequacies of the Scotland Act. There's no separation of powers up here. It's supposed to be central to the efficient running of a democratic country that you have a separation between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. That doesn't prevail in Scotland. The Crown Office was acting in consort with the executive of the Scottish government to silence and to stymie that investigation into the Salmond affair. That's deplorable. Yeah. That's inexcusable. And the fact that was somehow in the brickwork of the Scotland Act as put together in the late 1990s, and the bad smell of the SNP has found its way up through the cracks, and that's that we're in that settlement made there and then, that has to be addressed. The Scotland Act is not fit for purpose, and the devolved settlement as it manifests itself in Scotland is not fit for purpose.
It really isn't. And the problem as well, as you quite rightly pointed out earlier, is that they don't see anybody outside of Scotland as some organisation or firm that they answer to. We've asked the Scottish Government for a statement this morning, and as yet they still haven't provided one. And I'm sure they're sitting there thinking, why should we provide a statement to this English radio station? That'll be their thinking.
I'd be very surprised if their thinking was anything but that. As I say, I've never really thought that the SNP are about independence. The cry freedom nonsense. They're not about freedom of speech or anything else. They're about silencing freedom of speech, and they're not about independence. They're about privacy. They're about give us this bit of this island so that we can close the door, draw the curtains, and go about our business, and just you be on your way. That is the strategy. That's the thinking of the Scottish National Party. And, for 14 years in one form or another, that's the yoke under which, the people of Scotland have been living.
Yeah, they're quite happy to take our money, of course.
Well, yeah, that goes without saying.
Yes. But money without responsibility. Well, listen, it's going to be fascinating to watch, and we'll be, I'm sure, covering it all the way through the election as well. Neil Oliver, our college was TV presenter, King of Scotland, apparently, according to some people. Thank you very much indeed. We'll take more of your calls, of course, on this. If you're in Scotland, we'd love to hear from you because, you must have a view on what is going on. You may be one of those people who wants to defend Nicola Sturgeon from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune.